Good morning. Welcome to English Miller. Today, we analyze two major periods, the Restoration and the 18th century. Remember, this is an overview of two major periods, the Restoration and the 18th century. Literature from 1660 to 1785 divides into three shorter periods of 40 years each, which can be characterized as shown below. 1660 to 1700, death of John Dryden, emphasis on decorum or critical principles based on what is elegant, fit, and right. 1700 to 1745, death of Jonathan Swift, Alexander Pope in 1744, emphasis on satire and on a wider public readership. 1745 to 1784, death of Samuel Johnson, emphasis on revolutionary ideas. England's Augustine age was modelled on that of Rome, when Augustus Caesar re-established stability after civil war following Julius Caesar's assassination. English writers, following the restoration of King Charles II, felt themselves to be in a similar situation in which the arts, repressed under Cromwell, could now flourish. English writers endeavored to formulate rules of good writing modeled on classical works but with a new appeal to the passions in simple, often highly visual language. This embrace of new, neo, aims, and old models is called Neoclassicism. Horace's phrase, at picture poiesis, meaning as in painting, so in poetry, was interpreted to mean that poetry ought to be visual as well as a verbal art. Augustine poets began the country's focus on nature by examining the enduring truths of human nature. The classical genres from which Augustine writers sought to learn included epic, tragedy, comedy, pastoral, satire, and ode. Ensuring a good fit between the genre and its style, language, and tone was crucial. Augustine writing celebrates wit or inventiveness, quickness of thought, and aptness of descriptive images or metaphors. The heroic couplet, two lines of rhymed iambic pentameter, was the most important verse form of Pope's age, for it combined elegance and wit. Poets also continued to use blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter, not closed in couplets. Not just aristocrats and classically educated scholars wrote verse. Ordinary people also began to write poetry, often featuring broad humor and burlesque, thereby creating a distinction between high and low verse. Dryden was the most influential writer of the Restoration, for he wrote in every form important to the period: occasional verse, comedy, tragedy, heroic plays, odes, satires, translations of classical works, and produced influential critical essays concerning how one ought to write these forms. Restoration prose style grew more like witty, urban conversation and less like the intricate rhetorical style of previous writers like John Milton and John Donne. Simultaneously, Restoration literature continued to appeal to heroic ideals of love and honor, particularly on stage in heroic poetry. The other major dramatic genre was the Restoration comedy of manners, which emphasizes sexual intrigue and satirizes the elite's social behavior with witty dialogue. The Augustine era of writers like Swift, Defoe, Pope, Addison, and Steele was rich in satire and new prose forms that blended fact and fiction, such as news, criminal biographies, travelogues, political allegories, and romantic tales. Early 18th century dramas saw the development of sentimental comedy, in which goodness and high moral sentiments are emphasized, and the audience is moved not only to laugh but also to simplify. The theatre business boomed, celebrity performers flourished. Less important were the authors of the plays. James Thomson's poems on the seasons, beginning with Winter 1726, carried on the earlier poetic tradition of pastoral retreat and began a new trend of poetry focused on natural description. Novelists became better known than poets, and the intellectual prose forms such as the essay proliferated. The mid 18th century is often referred to as the Age of Johnson, after the renowned essayist Samuel Johnson, who in 1755 wrote one of the first English dictionaries to define word meanings by employing quotations taken from the best English writers, past and present. By the 1740s, the novel rose to dominate the literary marketplace, with writers like Henry Fielding, Samuel Richardson, and Lawrence Sterne defining the form and its modes of representing the private lives of individuals. The late 18th century saw a medieval revival in which writers venerated and imitated archaic language and forms. One important development of this movement was the Gothic novel, which typically features such forbidden themes as incest, murder, necrophilia, atheism, and sexual desire. Late 18th century poetry tends to emphasize melancholy, isolation, and reflection in distinction to the intensely social, often satirical verse of earlier in the period. Some critics place the end of the 18th century at 1776, linking it to the American Revolution. Others at 1789, the beginning of the French Revolution. Still others at 1798, the publication of Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads. Later, Romantic writers who valued the idea of originality also prized the meaning of revolution, which signified a violent break with the past and often represented their work as offering just such a break with tradition. However, changes to literary forms and content occurred much more gradually than this use of the word revolution might suggest. Thank you and have a nice day.